Another is we work with the U.S. Olympic diving team. So we're talking about platform diving. You jump off the board, spin 3.5 or 4.5 times in the air, and rip the water vertically. So we started with the elite divers in the U.S. diving, one of whom was Greg Louganis, who was generally considered to be the greatest diver that had lived up to that point. He won back-to-back gold medals in springboard and platform at 2 Olympics in a row. So part of our job was to figure out what him and some of the other divers, how they actually did what they did. And so there's an interesting story about that. It's the story of the Chinese diving team. So a number of years ago, when the applications for the Olympics came in, there was an application from the Chinese diving team. And everybody said, well, this ought to be interesting. There are no diving boards in China. It can be a dangerous sport. We hope nobody hurts themselves. So to everybody's amazement, not only did the Chinese show up, they showed up with a world-class diving team. So they went from nowhere to world-class seemingly instantaneously. So everybody started shaking their heads, trying to figure out how the hell did they do that? And they realized, well, okay, at every world competition for a number of years, there'd been some Oriental there with the camera taking pictures. And everybody thought, well, it's just a Japanese tourist. And a Japanese tourist, part of their uniform is always to have a camera around their neck. So nobody thought anything particularly about it. Well, it turned out they weren't Japanese tourists, they were Chinese coaches, and they were videotaping all of the elite divers. And the one they most wanted to copy was Greg Louganis. So they went back with their videotapes, they slowed it in slow motion, they dissected it frame by frame to get the exact motion that Greg went through in doing the dive. And then they selected kids at a very young age based on body type and body alignment, and they put them in a rigorous training program. Now, a rigorous training program is based on the Oriental model, means that you're training 8 to 10 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, which you would never be able to do in the West, because in the West, we've got this thing called life, and life gets in the way of practice. So in the Orient, they simply eliminated the life, and it was perpetual practice. And they blew out a lot of people's eyesights in the process, but they were able then, with practice, to get people that could do a dive that looked like Greg. So they were able to do a dive that looked like Greg. Now, the interesting thing was, then it looked like the way Greg dived, but it had nothing to do with the way that Greg actually dived. And this afternoon, we're going to get into some of what we call people patterns. And one of the patterns has to do with whether people are sameness or difference oriented. Now, the Chinese are a nation of copiers. They're famous for being able to rip off anything. They copy everything, and they're great at copying. So they could do dives that look like Greg, but they could never do a dive like Greg, because Greg is a total difference person. So Greg's got this great quote. In diving, there's a sweet spot on the board, right at the end. Sometimes I'm a little over, sometimes I'm a little under. I don't know till I'm in the air, but the judges don't know either. That's why I train so hard. I can't leave my mind on the board. I have to be able to key into the memory tapes of how to do it right. But I have to be able to do it right from all the wrong places. So he starts with whatever takeoff he's been given, and his whole dive is a process of continual correction until he hits the water. Now, the Chinese then, if they can hit the sweet spot, then they can do the dive that looks just like Greg. But if they're over or under, then they don't have a strategy for how to compensate and how to adjust in midair till they get there. Now, in diving, one of the things is, once again, you're jumping off a board, you're spinning like 3.5 times, and you got to know when to come out of the dive in order to hit the water vertically. And so usually you spot, which means as you're spinning around, you see the bottom of the diving board and you see the pool, and you then, based on where you're at, then you know when to start coming out. And now Greg was interesting. Most people, as I said, are doing it visually. The people that are not particularly good are trying to time it in their mind. So it's like 1, 2, 3. They'll count and then come out. And sometimes they're spinning faster, sometimes slower. That's not a good strategy to do it. Spotting is a better strategy. And Greg, what was interesting is, Greg was highly auditory. So in diving, there's sprinklers on the edge of the pool that break the surface tension. Because if you can see the pool, and if it's like glass, you don't know where the surface is, and you can hurt yourself seriously. So you need to know where the surface is, and these sprinklers cause ripples so you can see where the surface is. Well, Greg could tell how high he was above the water from the sound of those sprinklers. And no other diver we talked to even knew that the sprinklers were there. So he was getting information from a source that was available to everybody, but nobody paid attention to because they didn't think there was any information there of value. Also, he would listen to the rhythm of the board, and each board had a different song, and he'd adjust his dive and his song to the song of the board. So he was able to get in sync so he could get higher, and then giving him more time then to complete the dive. So he was able to do some amazing things. Also, we work with the coaches. So it takes 1.6 seconds from when you leave the board till you hit the water. Now, an expert diver could make that feel like 10 to 15 seconds. And the expert coaches could make that, slow it in their mind and make it seem like 15 seconds. So you got to be able to do time distortion. So how do you do time distortion? So the mechanism for time distortion is focus. So we get our ideas of time from things going past us in peripheral vision at a rapid rate. So if you can focus on a very narrow area, time seems to slow down. So Greg would say on the diving board, the third rivet from the left. So he would focus on the size of a single rivet in the diving board. And with this intense focus on a small area, then time would slow down. Now, this applies to a lot of areas. So in athletics, the ability to slow time down in many sports is a very important characteristic of your ability. Your ability to slow time down in a sales context so that you've got more time. So in other words, you're thinking faster to be able to respond. So the mechanism, as I said, is well understood and well known. It has to do with tunnel vision. So I worked with a guy, a very interesting guy, Frank Addington, from West Virginia, who was a professional archer. And what he would do is he would go around to high schools and universities, and it was part of a anti-drug program, and he would shoot aspirin tablets out of the air with a bow and arrow. So he had an assistant that would flip the aspirin tablet up, he would be there, and he would shoot the aspirin tablet out of the air with a bow and arrow. And so the aspirin tablet would go up, start slowing down as it go up, would reach the peak where it would be momentarily frozen, and then it would accelerate on the way down. So he had it lined up so he didn't need to worry about the left or right. It was straight up or down, and he just had to release at the top point in order to hit the aspirin tablet. Now, what he didn't understand was that he would use two kinds of aspirin tablets. He'd use a regular tablet, and he would use a baby aspirin tablet, which was a lot smaller. And he could hit the baby aspirin tablets better than he could hit the larger tablets. And he never understood that till I explained to him that the smaller the focus, then the time would slow down. And I stood behind him when he was doing this, and I think I could have probably hit it because, it looked like if you focused on the right thing, incredibly slow. I've been on a pistol range where under the right light conditions, you could pick the bullet coming out of the barrel of the gun and you could see it go down range. And you would think, well, a bullet travels so fast you can't see it. Well, if you can focus all of your attention on a very small point, and if you can catch it, then you can feel it and see it go down range. So there's a lot about the way our brains and our senses operate that you don't know. And that as a modeler, these are things we've got to figure out. If a human being is capable of doing it, they've got to have some way they do it. And you can figure out how they do it, and then you can train other people to do that. So, now,